The Galactic Empire had always governed with a velvet fist. Its control over Earth was subtle but absolute. Humanity had been integrated into the Empire's vast collection of subjugated worlds, kept docile through treaties, trade, and the unspoken threat of overwhelming force. For years, humans had believed that their compliance ensured survival, but that fragile belief was about to be shattered. The assassinations began quietly. A renowned scientist, a rising political leader, an influential journalist, all found dead under mysterious circumstances. At first, it seemed like chance, a string of unfortunate incidents. But as more key figures fell, whispers of something darker spread through the corridors of power. In the heart of Earth's largest city, Lydia Crane, director of Earth's Intelligence Bureau, studied the reports in grim silence. The deaths were not coincidental. After weeks of intensive investigation, her analysts had uncovered a chilling truth. Alien assassins, sent by the Galactic Empire, were systematically eliminating Earth's most crucial minds. They were silent, unseen, and lethal. The attacks were designed not to instill fear among the general population, but to weaken humanity at its core, to strip it of its leaders and thinkers before anyone realized what was happening. Lydia's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of her desk. The assassins weren't just skilled killers. They were something far worse. The data suggested they were members of an elite group known as the Silent Shadows, an ancient sect of alien warriors who had been weaponized by the Empire for centuries. Each one was a master of infiltration, using advanced cloaking technology and biological enhancements to blend into any environment. They moved like ghosts, and their targets never saw them coming. Across the room, Agent Ramirez, her chief field operative, broke the silence. "They're dismantling us, piece by piece. If this keeps up, there won't be anyone left to lead Earth, let alone mount a resistance." Lydia nodded. She had known the risks of dealing with the Empire, but she never imagined they would resort to such covert brutality. The Silent Shadows were far more than any military force could handle, slipping through defenses like shadows through fog. No human force could even detect them, let alone fight them. "We can't afford to let this continue," she murmured. "We need to take action, drastic action." Ramirez frowned. "We've tried everything. If our best agents couldn't stop them—" "There's someone who can," Lydia interrupted, her voice steely. "Jim and Jane." Ramirez's eyes widened. Jim and Jane. The names were whispered in the dark corners of the galaxy, legends of two rogue bounty hunters who operated beyond the Empire's reach. They weren't known for subtlety, but for their deadly efficiency, taking down some of the most dangerous criminals in the galaxy. And their methods? Brutal, merciless, and, most importantly, effective. But they had a reputation for rejecting authority, working only for their own gain. "They're not exactly team players," Ramirez warned. "Why would they help us?" Lydia leaned back, a glint of determination in her eyes. "They've worked for credits before, and they have a personal vendetta against the Empire. A few years ago, one of the Silent Shadows tried to take them out. They barely survived, and I suspect they've been waiting for a chance to settle that score." A heavy silence settled between them. Ramirez knew the Silent Shadows were ruthless, but Jim and Jane were a wild card. He wasn't sure which was more dangerous, the assassins or the bounty hunters. But with humanity's survival on the line, there was no room for caution. "We need to find them," Lydia continued. "Convince them to take on the mission. They're our last chance." Ramirez nodded slowly, already calculating the steps needed to track down the infamous duo. "If they agree, how do we control them?" "We don't," Lydia said coldly. "We give them the tools, point them at the target, and get out of the way." As Ramirez left to make preparations, Lydia stared out the window at the sprawling city below. It still thrummed with life, ignorant of the invisible death stalking its leaders. But that peace wouldn't last. The Silent Shadows were closing in, and soon Earth would be defenseless. But not if Jim and Jane had anything to say about it. The dusty outpost on the fringe of human-controlled space was quiet, the kind of quiet that made ordinary people uneasy. But Jim and Jane weren't ordinary people. For them, silence was a welcome companion, a sign that their enemies hadn't caught up to them yet. Not today, at least. Inside a rundown cantina, Jim leaned back in his chair, boots propped up on the table, scanning the room with his sharp, cold eyes. His tall, muscular frame was relaxed, but a coiled tension lingered beneath the surface, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Across from him sat Jane, slender and agile, her movements precise as she methodically cleaned a small energy pistol. The two bounty hunters were legends, though neither cared much for the fame. Their lives were defined by the hunt, by the thrill of the chase and the finality of the kill. "You think they'll find us here?" Jane asked without looking up, her voice smooth but edged with the weariness of someone who had seen too much death. "If they do," Jim replied with a slow smile, "they won't live to tell about it." They had spent years hunting some of the galaxy's most dangerous criminals, from rogue warlords to alien war machines. Their methods were brutal and efficient, and they had long stopped questioning the morality of their work. The only thing that mattered to Jim and Jane was survival. Together. It had been that way since they had first teamed up, bound by a mutual respect and a fierce loyalty that few outsiders understood. Suddenly, the bar door slid open and a man stepped inside. His military uniform, sharp and out of place in the rough outpost, drew immediate attention. Jim and Jane exchanged a glance but didn't move. It wasn't the first time someone had come looking for them, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, it wasn't just a bounty or a job. This time, it was something bigger. The man, Agent Ramirez, approached their table cautiously. "Jim, Jane," he nodded in greeting, his eyes lingering on the weapons that were never far from their hands. "I'm here on behalf of Earth's Intelligence Bureau. We need your help." Jane snorted, finally holstering her pistol. "And what makes you think we'd be interested in playing soldier?" Ramirez didn't flinch. The silent shadows. The room seemed to still. The Silent Shadows were a name even these hardened bounty hunters hadn't forgotten. Years ago, one of the Empire's top assassins had come for them. They'd barely escaped, and it had cost them both, physically and emotionally. For Jim, it had left a jagged scar across his chest, a constant reminder of their close brush with death. For Jane, it had been worse, the knowledge that they had been marked by the Empire itself. Jim sat up, his demeanor shifting from casual to dangerous in an instant. "What about them?" "They're targeting human leaders," Ramirez said bluntly. "Scientists, generals, politicians. Earth is on the brink of losing everything, and no one else can stop them. The Silent Shadows are like ghosts. Our forces can't see them, can't track them. But you two, you've faced them before. You know how they think." Jane's eyes narrowed. "We barely survived last time, and you're asking us to take on the entire squad." Ramirez leaned forward. "I'm asking you to do what you do best. Hunt them down, make them afraid. You won't be alone. We'll provide you with the latest tech, intel, and a lot of credits. You'll have every resource we can offer." Jim glanced at Jane. For years, they'd avoided entanglements like this, preferring to stay under the radar, hunting criminals for profit and staying one step ahead of their own enemies. But this was different. The Silent Shadows weren't just any target. This was personal. "You think we care about your credits?" Jim asked, his voice low and dangerous. "We don't work for governments. We don't take orders." Ramirez didn't back down. "I'm not asking you to follow orders. I'm asking you to do what you do best. Destroy the ones who nearly killed you." Jane's hand tightened around her pistol. "And if we say no?" Ramirez's gaze was steady. "Then Earth falls. And it won't be long before the Empire comes for you again. Only this time, there won't be anyone left to stop them." Silence stretched between them, the weight of the decision heavy in the air. Jim and Jane had spent their lives running, fighting for survival. But now, for the first time, the fight had come to them. The Silent Shadows were still out there, and this was their chance to finish what had started all those years ago. Jane nodded once, her decision made. "We're in." Jim stood, his expression unreadable, but the dangerous glint in his eyes spoke volumes. "But we do this our way." Ramirez smiled grimly. "That's all we ask." The vast urban sprawl of Earth's capital was a maze of towering buildings and hidden alleys, perfect for those who didn't want to be found. The silent shadows had chosen their battleground well. But Jim and Jane thrived in the chaos of unfamiliar territory. They knew how to find ghosts. From the top of a high-rise, Jane peered through her scope, scanning the city streets below. Her eyes were sharp, catching the smallest details. Glitches in the air where light bent unnaturally, flickers of movement that shouldn't exist. The silent shadows were masters of invisibility, using cloaking tech that made them nearly impossible to detect. "Nearly. They're here," she murmured, her voice calm but brimming with tension. "3 of them, moving in tandem. They're getting ready for another hit." Jim, standing beside her, adjusted the settings on his wrist console, feeding the data into their custom tracking system. It had taken weeks to modify their gear, using a mix of Earth's latest tech and their own black market upgrades. But now, they had something no one else did, a way to counter the silent shadows' invisibility, at least long enough to kill them. "Good," Jim said, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "Time to show them who they're dealing with." They moved swiftly, descending into the labyrinth below. Unlike military forces, who would flood the area with soldiers and scan for heat signatures, Jim and Jane operated on instinct and precision. They knew better than to chase shadows. Instead, they laid traps. Down in the alleyways, Jane placed motion-triggered explosives in the most likely escape routes. Every alley, every dark corner, became a potential death trap. The silent shadows might be invisible, but they weren't invincible. A single misstep, and they'd trigger a blast powerful enough to expose them. Jim, meanwhile, was setting up EMP grenades, designed to disrupt the shadows' cloaking tech. With a short-range pulse, he could momentarily strip away their invisibility and force them into a fight. Their methods were anything but clean. This wasn't about capturing or negotiating. The silent shadows had no humanity to appeal to, no sense of mercy. Jim and Jane understood that, which is why their approach was simple: kill or be killed. It didn't take long for the shadows to fall into their trap. The first sign was a faint shimmer in the air, followed by the distinct sound of rapid footsteps. Jim barely had time to react before one of the assassins was on him, a blade flashing in the dim light. But Jim had fought the silent shadows before. His reflexes kicked in, and he sidestepped the attack just as Jane detonated a trap behind them. The explosion rocked the alley, throwing debris and dust into the air. For a moment, the assassin's cloaking flickered, revealing a lithe, insectoid figure armed with twin daggers. Its dark, chitinous armor was designed to absorb energy, making it a lethal blend of organic and technological enhancements. But now, it was exposed, and that was all Jim and Jane needed. Jim lunged, his blade flashing out in a blur, catching the assassin across its midsection. It screeched a terrible, guttural sound, but Jim didn't stop. With a quick, brutal movement, he finished it off, driving his weapon deep into its core. The assassin fell, its body twitching, before going still. "One down." "2 more," Jane said, her voice crisp through the comms. "They're splitting up, trying to flank us." Jim wiped the alien blood from his blade, his eyes narrowing. Let them try. They moved with lethal efficiency, knowing that hesitation could mean death. Every alley they passed through was rigged with traps, each step forward calculated. Jane's rifle was ready, the scope tuned to detect even the faintest shimmer of movement. When the next assassin appeared, trying to outflank Jim from above, she was ready. A single shot rang out, her bullet enhanced with a small EMP charge. It hit the assassin squarely in the chest, disrupting its cloaking field. For a brief moment, the creature was visible, a grotesque, reptilian figure, hissing in fury. That moment was all she needed to fire again, this time directly between its eyes. The creature crumpled, crashing down onto the street below. 2 down, but the third assassin was the most dangerous. Jim could feel it now. The silent predator watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This one was smarter, faster, and more patient. It knew the game as well as they did. Jane spoke first. "It's close." Jim nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Let it come." They waited in the dark, every muscle tense, every breath controlled. Then, like a whisper on the wind, the third assassin struck. It moved faster than the others. A blur of motion, claws outstretched, heading straight for Jane. But Jim was ready. He hurled an EMP grenade at the ground between them. The pulse erupted, forcing the creatures cloaking to drop mid-strike. Jane spun, a blade in her hand, and in one fluid motion, she slashed across the assassin's throat. The alien staggered, gasping for air, its once invisible body now fully exposed. With a final, vicious twist, Jim ended it. 3 down. Breathing heavily, they stood amidst the wreckage of their brutal ambush. Their methods were harsh, but they worked. The silent shadows had learned that tonight, and soon the rest of them would learn it too. The night sky over Earth's capital burned with the light of descending warships. The Galactic Empire had made its final move, with its elite assassins failing to cripple Earth's leadership. It had sent its fleet to deliver the killing blow. The silent invasion had turned into an open declaration of war. Humanity's last stand was at hand. In the midst of the chaos, Jim and Jane stood on the edge of a bombed-out skyscraper, watching the ominous glow of the Empire's ships as they descended through the atmosphere. The silent shadows, the Empire's invisible killers, had failed. Now, the Empire was sending a full force to crush any resistance. For Jim and Jane, the mission had never been about saving humanity, until now. They had hunted the silent shadows for revenge, but as the warships closed in, they realized this was no longer just about vengeance. If Earth fell, there would be nowhere left for them to run. "We've got one shot at this," Jane said, adjusting the scope on her rifle. Her voice was steady, but her hands moved with deadly precision. Jim nodded, gripping his energy blade tightly, feeling the weight of it as if it were an extension of his arm. "Yeah, and if we miss, we're dead." The 2 bounty hunters had been through hell and back, but nothing could have prepared them for what lay ahead. The final assassin, the leader of the silent shadows, had revealed himself. He was different, taller, more formidable, and far more dangerous than any they had encountered before. Known only as Krexer, he was a master of both combat and strategy, the perfect predator. Krexer wasn't just an assassin. He was the Empire's final weapon. "He's out there," Jim growled, scanning the streets below. The assassin moved like a ghost through the wreckage, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "He's watching us." "I know," Jane muttered. "Let's give him something to watch." They moved through the rubble, silent and swift, navigating the collapsed buildings and broken streets. Around them, the few remaining Earth forces fought a desperate battle against the Empire's infantry, but Jim and Jane had only one target. They had to kill Krexer before he completed his mission. The assassination of Earth's remaining leaders, hidden deep within a fortified bunker just a few blocks away. As they closed in on their destination, Krexer struck. He emerged from the shadows without warning, a towering figure clad in obsidian armor that shimmered with every step. His eyes, glowing faintly, locked onto Jim and Jane with an intensity that sent a chill down their spines. "You've come far," Krexer hissed, his voice a low, guttural growl. "But this is where your hunt ends." Jim wasted no time. He lunged forward, his energy blade slicing through the air toward Krexer's chest. But Krexer was faster. With a swift, fluid motion, he parried the strike, sending Jim stumbling backward. Before he could recover, Krexer lashed out with his own weapon, a pair of serrated daggers that seemed to hum with lethal energy. Jane fired from her vantage point, her shot aimed straight for Krexer's head. But Krexer moved within human speed, dodging the bullet as if he had seen it coming before she had even pulled the trigger. "He's too fast," Jane muttered, repositioning herself for another shot. Jim grimaced, circling Krexer, looking for any opening. We got to slow him down. Krexer's glowing eyes flickered with amusement. You think you can defeat me? I've killed hundreds like you. You're nothing but a distraction. But Jim and Jane were far from ordinary prey. They had fought their way across countless worlds, against enemies just as relentless. They didn't fight fair, and they didn't back down. As Krexer charged at Jim again, Jane threw an EMP grenade into his path. The pulse exploded, disorienting Krexer for a split second. Just long enough for Jim to land a vicious blow. His blade slashed across Krexer's armor, leaving a deep gash. The assassin roared in pain, but he wasn't done yet. Krexer retaliated with a fury that pushed Jim and Jane to their limits. His blades danced through the air, a whirlwind of lethal strikes. Jim blocked and parried, but each clash sent painful vibrations up his arm. Krexer was stronger than any opponent they had ever faced. But Jane had seen a weakness, a small, flickering glitch in Krexer's cloaking mechanism, triggered by the EMP. Jim, his armor's failing. Keep him distracted. Jane shouted as she set up her rifle, this time locking onto the exposed weak point in his suit. Jim barely had time to acknowledge the command before Krexer lunged at him, his blades aimed at Jim's throat. But Jim sidestepped just in time, ducking low and driving his own blade into Krexer's side. The assassin howled, and in that moment of vulnerability, Jane fired. Her shot struck Krexer dead center, piercing through the weakened armor. The force of the impact knocked him off balance, and Jim seized the opportunity, delivering a final, decisive strike to his heart. Krexar's body went rigid, his glowing eyes flickering one last time before they dimmed. The silent shadow fell, his reign of terror over. Breathing heavily, Jim and Jane stood over Krexer's lifeless body. The city burned around them, but they had won. For now. We're not done yet, Jane said, watching the Empire's warships overhead. No, Jim agreed, a glint of determination in his eyes. But this was a hell of a start.